In this Construct 2 tutorial, we'll be covering how to create a top 10 highest score screen, like this. As you can see, we have our player names and their scores, and when we get a high enough score when we're playing, we'll be prompted to enter our name. And our score will be sorted appropriately. Additionally, when we refresh or restart our game, our high scores will be saved. Now, before we go any further, there's always better ways to code anything, but this is what worked for me and could be a springboard for you to make something better. So, by all means, feel free to leave suggestions for improvements in the comments. And I will be using Construct 2 release 277. I haven't used Construct 3 yet, but I imagine what I show here will work there too. Right now, let's set up everything we'll need. Just about everything we'll need. So first things first, we have a layout called title, and it has a text object called title, a button called start, and another button called scores. This takes us to our game, and this takes us to our high score screen. And this is our fake game. Our lowest score will be displayed here and in the low score text, and our current score will be displayed here. This will be a randomly generated number, pretending we're destroying baddies in our game and getting points. And then this button right here should say game over, because this button will take us to the score screen when we lose all of our lives or any other scenario that takes us to the high score screen. And then lastly, we have the scores layout with a back button, and I just took the title text, dragged it over, and just put it here and changed the text. So don't need to create multiple text objects. All right, with that, let's start adding some code. Let's start off with some global variables. Now, it doesn't really matter where you create them, but I'm going to create them in an event sheet I'm calling global sheet. I do this in most of my projects with, if there's any sort of code that's going to be generally shared everywhere, I put it here. So I like to put my global variables here. So I'm going to right click, add global variable, and we're going to call this cur score. And this is the player's current score. All right. I'm going to add another variable. We're going to call this lowest score. The lowest score in the top 10 list. Okay, so we set up our variables, and now what we want to do, let's just set this lower score to maybe 5 just for now. And our current score will be 0. Great. Okay, so now we want to display these numbers on our game screen, and we also want to create a score, our random current score, whenever we click on the screen. So I'm going to double click, and I'm going to search for the mouse, and I'm going to add the mouse to the project. So now if we go to our game sheet, I'm going to right click, add group, and we're going to call this display information, because right now we're just going to set the text to what it should be. So I'm going to add a sub event, and for here, text current score, we're going to set text. No, we're going to right. We need to set a condition. So we want to, on every tick, we want to set the text to our current score. And then what we also want to do, I'll copy this, paste it, and I'm going to right click on top of the object here and go to replace object. And I'm going to replace it with the low score text. And I'm going to change this to quote because we're using a string, which is a piece of text, lowest score space end. And then I'm going to add an ampersand, and now I can adjoin my variable, which will be lowest score. All right, so now if we were to run the game, nothing changes. I see exactly what I did wrong. So when I was copying and pasting my layouts when I was creating them, I did not say what the appropriate event sheet should be for this. So this one's event sheet should be game sheet, and for scores, this should be scores sheet. Great. So now if we were to run this, boom, displays the appropriate numbers. All right. Now, when we go to our game sheet, we're now going to create some code to generate a random number for our current score. So I'm going to add another group. I'm going to call this create score. Going to add a sub event, and we're going to have mouse on any click. So on any click, set value of current score to random, and we're going to set our lowest value. We're going to say that will be 100, and our highest value will be 9001, because it's going to get all the values between 100 and 9000. So it's actually not going to get 9001, it will just get 9000. But that's going to create a little bit of an issue, as we'll see in a moment. So if we were to run this and then click, it looks like our number isn't actually displaying. Well, what's going on here? Well, if we run our debugger, we'll see that actually our current score is way too big to fit onto the screen because it has some decimals. So we want to remove those decimals. Now there's two common ways I've seen it done. One is by surrounding your random in an int. This will turn your random number into an integer and essentially lop off the decimal points. The other way I've seen it done is by using floor. This rounds your number down to the nearest whole number. So essentially they both accomplish the same thing. I'm not sure what the difference is, but since I see most people use floor, I'm going to use floor. And now when we run this, yeah, we can now see our number. Great. And yes, the last thing we're going to do before we finish setup, we're going to include our global sheet in all of our sheets. This is so that way the information and code that we'll do in the next part can be referred basically in any layout. All right, and now we're set. We will be using an array to store our high scores. Now, if you don't know what an array is think of it as an Excel sheet or spreadsheet. So here we have a list of 10 names and 10 scores. And what we're going to do with this is whenever we get a high score, we're going to take the first score and name, which would be at the top of the list, and our lowest score, and replacing it with our new score in name. Now, as far as sorting everything so that way it's in appropriate position, we'll worry about that next. For now, let's just try to get this working. So first things first, we need to include an array in our project. Doesn't matter where you do it, I'm just going to do it here. So double click and array is right there. And now an array has been added to the project. And I'm going to rename the array high scores. And now we have the properties of the array. So our array is going to have a width of 2 because it has 2 columns and a height of 10 because there are 10 items in each column. So we're going to change this to 2 and change this to 10. Now we don't have to worry about depth. That's for 3-dimensional arrays. We're just working with 2D arrays. Alright, so now that we have an empty array, we need to fill that array with our default scores. We're going to do that in our global sheet. And we're going to do that with functions. And if you're unfamiliar with functions, think of them as a convenient way to do an action that you're going to call upon repeatedly, but you don't want to have to copy and paste the code every single time you want to do it. So actually, anywhere, we'll need to add a function. So go here, function, insert, and now we have a function. So now go into our global sheet. We're going to create a new group, and we're going to call this populate names and scores functions. Pretty literal. Okay, and we're going to add a sub-event. And we're going to say on function, and we're going to call the function populate names. So what we want to happen is we want it to go through all of our empty, our first column in our array and enter in all of our default names. Now, to do that, we're going to be accessing the coordinates of an array, which look like this. So this is essentially a one-to-one comparison, ignoring this names of the columns. So the first number that you see here is the x position, and the second is the y. As you'll note, we start off at 0, not number 1. So you'll see that it ends on the y position 9, but since we do start at 0, there are 10 items here. And when we move over to an x position by 1, our x becomes 1. And it's still, the y position goes up as we go down the column. And it's kind of useful to have one of these diagrams. I can't tell you how many times I have made mistakes because I screwed up where exactly the positions in arrays are, so useful for anyone to have this visualization. Okay, so what we're going to do is at our array, we're going to set at x, y, so 0, 0, which would be right here, which would be our first name. We're going to set this to player A. And now we're going to copy this, and since we want to go down 1, that's going to be 0, 1. So change the y to 1 and change this to B. And now let's just copy this and paste it 8 more times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, and now we're just going to very laboriously start filling in what all these values in the array should be. Okay, so As you see, we now have populated all of our first column with names. Let's run this with the debugger and see what this looks like. Ah, right. Well, we can't exactly see what it looks like until we actually call the function. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go to our title sheet, and I'm going to add a group. We're going to call this group populate array at start. And we're going to add a sub event, and we're going to say not on start of layout, but on loader layout complete. Essentially, this is when the game first loads and has finished loading everything. So if we do on start of layout, then it's going to override what the scores are every time we go to the title screen. So we're going to do on loader layout complete. And actually, you know what we'll do that. So then on our function, we're going to call function, and we're going to call populate names. Now, if we were to run this and then check our array, we'll see that our names are filled in. Okay, so now going back to our global sheet, we're going to do the same thing except for our scores. So we're going to change this to populate scores. And let's just get rid of all of this. And now this is going to be 1, 0. We're moving over the x position by 1. And we're going to set this to 100. And now we're going to paste this 9 more times. Okay. And once again, we're going to go through the fun process of manually setting all of these. Okay, looks like all the numbers are in order. Let's go back to our title screen, and we're going to say function on function populate scores. And when we run this and check our array is populated. Now here's what I'm going to do. Let's see, I'm going to cut this out. I'm going to paste this into our global sheet. And if I'm correct, yeah, that works much better. So the reason why that's a good idea is that anytime we happen to run our game from any one of these different screens, since it's calling the global sheet, it's saying, hey, when this is finished loading, go ahead and populate the array. So that's going to save us some trouble further down the line. Okay. We need to first determine exactly what our low score is. So on our title sheet, we're going to say add event. And we're going to say every tick, we want to, system, set value. We're going to set the lowest score to what would be this value right here, 1, 0. So array dot at 1, 0. So that way we can, when we start the game, we'll be able to compare appropriately. Okay. Now what we want to do is in our score sheet, we're going to add a group. And we're going to say, is there a high score? Kind of literal once again, but that's okay. And we're going to add a sub event in which we're going to compare two values. So if cur score, I should say, is greater than lowest score, what we want to do is set at xy. So at 0, 0, which would be our name, we're going to set this to that's me. And we're going to copy this, and we're going to move over 1, and we're going to say this is our cur score. So now when we go and so if our score is higher, we're going to replace the lowest score here. So let's run that and see what happens. A little hard to do that when these buttons don't do anything yet. On our title sheet, we're going to add a group, and we're going to call it Title Navigation. We're going to add a sub-event, and we're going to say when you press the start button on clicked, we're going to go to another layout. We're going to go to the game layout. Okay, and let's copy this, paste it again. I'm going to right click this and replace the object with the scores button. And instead of going to game, we want to go to scores. Okay, and now we'll go to the game sheet and we'll add another group. We'll call it Game Navigation. And essentially we'll do the same thing here. So on clicked of the game over button, we want to go to layout, and we're going to go to scores. And then lastly, scores navigation. So on the back button being clicked, we want to go to the title. All right. Now that we've done that, let's play this. All right, so as you can see, it took our lowest score. It's not 5 like we manually entered, it's now 100. And if we go to play, all right, that looks like a high score. Game over. And now if we check our array, you'll see, hey, that's me, and I'm suddenly here. Though if we do go back, we'll now see that 4,606 is now our lowest score, which isn't right, but we're going to take care of that right now. Let's create an array that sorts our scores from lowest to highest. So I'm going to go to our global sheet, and I'm going to add a new group, and we're going to call this sort scores function. And I'm going to add a sub event, and we're going to make a function, and we're going to call it sort scores. All right, so to illustrate how this works, I took a screenshot of that existing prototype you saw in action, or at least its code. So right here, we have our function sort scores. And we're going to go for a for loop. And we're going to go through it the number of times equal to the high score's height. So if you recall, our height is 10, which means we want to go through this list 10 times. Now we're going to start sorting, which is going to be the name of our loop, from 1 and end on array high scores height -1. Now why is that? Well, if you recall, I just said that array high scores that height is 10, and if you look over here, as you can see, there is no 10 in our array. If we were to try to access 10, it would be outside of the array. So that's why we subtracted 1 from it to make it 9. Additionally, we start at 1 because of the way that we're comparing. So as you can see here, array high scores at 1, z minus 1. So if our z value is 2, then that means we would be looking at this spot right here. And then it's saying if this is greater than the position at 1, 2, if we're substituting the 2 in for the z, then we would be comparing this. And so what we want to happen now is, okay, we determined that this value is greater than this value. We need to swap these around. So the way that's going to happen, I'll demonstrate it here, is that we're going to save this information in a temporary spot. So that way we can then copy the information from here, paste it here, and then take the information from where we saved it and paste it in its new location. Now, there is a term for how this sorting works and how efficient it is. I forget what it is, but I know that with the low amount of information we're working with, this sorting method is fine. And if we go back here, we can see that yes, we set a temporary name and number, and then we set the values at that old location to the new location. So now I'll just go ahead and copy all of that code that I already made. Just jumping back in because I realized I did not explain exactly what these were. So in case you're not familiar, these are local numbers. So essentially, unlike the global numbers that can be accessed everywhere, these local numbers can only be accessed in a very localized area. So if I were to try to do something here that calls on the number z, it's not going to do anything. And you add those by right-clicking above the group that you want to add a variable to and go to Add Local Variable. And right here, we're going to add temp name. And this is going to have a store name of lower scoring player. And so that's how you add them. And additionally, with the z, this is being set to be our looped index, which is what count are we going through the for loop? Is this the 0th time, the first time, the second time, third time, so on and so forth? Okay, looks like we got things all sorted out. So if everything is working properly, when we call the sort scores function, it should sort our scores. So that's what we're going to do. On our score sheet, we're going to, after you replace the name and score, we're going to call the function sort scores. So now let's run this and see what happens. We have our array open here. All right, that's good enough. And for some reason, it duplicated our score. Okay, I got it. So what's going on here? The problem is that this is continuing to fire when it should only fire once. So we're going to add another condition. It's just going to be on start of layout. So now if we were to run everything, all right, awesome. So as you can see, it got rid of player A and their score of 100. And now that's me is entered here with their score. And if we were to go back to the title screen and take a look here, we'll see that, hey, our lowest score is 300. Now, we do want to set this back to 0, so let's just go ahead and do that real quick. So title sheet, and we're just gonna put this below on start of layout. We're going to set the value of cur score to 0. All right, so that resets our score. So instead of continually checking the debugger for what our high scores are, let's visualize them on the screen. I'm going to create a new text object here called, and we're going to put it here, and we're going to call this text scorers. These are our high scorers. And we'll make this 20. A little smaller. Whatever. So we're going to put you right here, and let's just set some default text. So we're going to go name, and then we have their score. Great. So now what we're going to do is copy and paste that a couple more times. Now, I'm not creating a new object. That was kind of a mistake that I would make when I first started out making construct. But there is a smarter way of populating all these names without having to create separate objects for all of them. So as you can see, all of these are text scores. And you know what? I'm not digging the height of that. So I'm going to turn off snap to grid. There we go. All right, that's a little better. We'll turn that back on. Great. So let's also just make them a little wider. Oop. Cool. So now what we're going to do is populate these. So now we're going to create a new group, and we'll call it display scores. And we're going to take a look at another screenshot for this explanation. So we're creating more local numbers. The 9 right here is representing our place in the array, and then this place variable is actually representing the place. So first place, second place, third place, etc. And now we have a for loop for each of the text scores. So since there's 10 of them, it's going to go through this 10 times while n is greater than 0. So while our position in array is greater than 0, we're going to set the text to place, which is going to be the first place, second place, a period, some spaces, followed by, you can't really see it here, but it's going to display the name, and then it's going to display the score. Construct has a weird way of previewing when you add returns to your code. But that is what it says here. The only reason why this exists here for n equals 0 is because when n equals 0, our place is going to be 10th. And 10 has 2 characters versus all the other numbers have 1 character. So this is just a little bit of a different spacing for 10, just so that way it lines up more nicely. And then after you go through all of this, it is going to subtract 1 from n, and then it's going to add 1 to place. So we're going to kind of go in reverse order through our array to create our high score list. Now let me go and copy this code. Okay, so we have everything set up, and let me just open this up so you can get an idea of what I did here. So place, add a period after it, 2 spaces, then display the person's name, and then we want to add a few more spaces and display their score. And the same thing was done here. I just removed some extra spaces because this is 10th place, and as we said, 2 characters ruins everything. So let's run this and see what happens. And it looked like it all worked. Great. So now if we go play, we get a score, game over. That's me. I'm there. And if we were to do this again, that's me again. Awesome. So now we want to allow the players to enter their names manually when they get a high score. So to do that, we're going to go back to our scores sheet, and we're going to add a text box. So text box will allow people to enter in their names. Plenty big enough there. All right. And now we're going to click on this, and we're going to add an instance variable. And this is going to, we're going to call it is new high score. And we're going to set this to false. Enter name when there is a new high score. Cool. So now what we're going to do, when we go back to our score sheet, we're going to change a few things. One, is there a high score? So we're going to add a function action here, and we're going to, oh, we should probably name our text box. That would be nice. Text box player name. All right. So we're going to set Boolean, and we're going to set it to true. And we're going to disable the rest of these because we're not going to do those quite yet. What we want to do now is create a new group, and we're going to call it enter name. And let's see, is Boolean instance variable set? And so if this is true, then what we want to do is, let's see, we want this box to be visible. So set visibility, visible. We also want to disable the back button, so that way the player can't leave without entering their name. What we also want is after they type their name and hit enter, their score will be submitted. And currently no way of detecting keyboard presses, so let's go ahead and add the keyboard. Okay, so we added the keyboard, and with this is not the case, so we'll just copy and paste that, and we'll invert it. I think we could use an else statement here, but this is just, this works as well. We want this to be invisible, and we're going to set you to be enabled. So now that we set this up, let's work on what to do when someone enters their name in the keyboard. So we're going to add a new event below, and we're going to say, it doesn't really matter the order, but on key pressed, and we're going to choose enter, and we're going to add another condition. If new is high score is true, and one more thing, let's see, we're going to compare the text. So if the text is blank, now we're going to right click this and invert it. So now it's a case if the text is not blank, then we can submit that score and whatnot. So now we can actually go back up here and cut all of this out and paste it here. And we're going to not disable it anymore. The last thing we're going to do here is now we need to set this Boolean to false. Okay, so let's go run this. So play, I got a high score. I can't go back, this is disabled. So now I have to enter my name. And, oh, whoops. I shouldn't have copied everything directly, of course. So what we want to do is, this is the whole point we were doing it. So instead of that's me, we're going to do text box, player name dot text. Yes. Okay, so let's try this again. Play, got a score, enter our name. Boom, now we're here. Awesome. So one little problem, let me just go right back here, is that so we get a high score. We can enter in as long of a name as we want, and then it causes some visual problems. So we can clamp down on that by going back here. So we're going to take this and we're going to surround it with something called left. It's going to take text and a count. So the text is this, and the number of characters we want it to retain, let's just say 8. So the first 8 characters are what's going to be displayed. As far as limiting the typing to 8 characters, I'm not sure exactly how to do that, but I do know how to restrict the display. So let's run that again. And I type a really long name, and it only displays the first 8 characters. Awesome. So you can set that to be as long or as short as you want. If you want to do classic arcade, you can even say, hey, the first 3 characters. One thing to do, which would be nice, is to display what the player's score is on the high score screen. So I'm just gonna shrink that a little bit, and yeah, let's move everything up one. All right, and I'm going to take our curse score. Great. Make that much smaller. Yeah, that works. Okay, so your score is this, and on the score sheet we're going to say, yeah, on display scores we're going to insert a new event below, and we're going to compare a variable. So if our curse score is greater than 0, we're going to set the text of curse score to your score and curse score. And we'll copy this, paste it, and we'll say if it's equal to 0, then we're just going to display nothing, essentially turning it invisible. Okay, So now if we run this and go to high scores, our high score is 0, nothing is displayed. If we go to play and we get something and go to game over, then our score is displayed here. And we'll say name. And yeah. Okay, so we've pretty much done everything. We have a high score screen. And when we go play and we get a high enough score, we can enter in our name and be added to the high score list. But it's going to feel kind of worthless when you refresh or start up the game again. Your scores are gone and it just resets back to default. So now we're going to go over how to save your scores. So to save our data, we are going to be using local storage. It will save your information to your device. So that means if someone does boot up the game on a different computer, they will get their own set of high scores that they'll be able to save and use, and it will be different from yours. So we first need to add the local storage object right here. And now we're going to switch over to some code that I already wrote again, so that way we can show how it all works. Okay, so right here I have this code on the title sheet, but we would actually move it to the global sheet. But as you can see right here, we had our old populate high scores, which is similar to what we had on the other one, and we're not going to exactly be using this anymore. Instead, what's going to happen is we are going to check if all of these different items exist. All these player A0 through 9 represent the player names, and score A0 through 9 represent the scores. So it's checking on the start of the layout if these items exist, which means do we already have some local data stored somewhere? If there is no local storage, we are going to populate the names with the defaults. So on item player A0 missing, we're going to call the populate names function, which will populate the array with all of our default names. We don't need to check if item missing on all the other players because we're pretty sure that if this is missing, everything else is missing. But let's say that they do exist. So there's probably a better way of doing this, but this is how I did it. So if player A exists, set the value that is in player A0 to 0, 0. If player A1 exists, set it to 0, 1. So now we are setting our array to everything that is in our local storage, so that way it can be used. And we'll do a similar thing with scores. If the first score is missing, then we'll call populate scores. We're also going to call sort scores, which will make more sense in a moment. And on the item existing, we're going to take whatever value is here and add it to the array at the appropriate location, and at the very end call sort scores. So let's just go ahead and copy that. Okay, back to our regular code that we're working on the global sheet. We disabled populate array at start, and we created a new group called populate array from local storage. So it does the same things we talked about. It checks if the item exists, all the different necessary items. If they don't exist, call the function. If they do exist, set the array to those appropriate items and call sort scores. Now, one thing you will note is that unlike the other sheet, I changed it from saying player A0 to player B0. So I didn't just do this because I wanted to differentiate the two bits of code. It turns out, as I found out with some testing, that if you have two totally separate projects but they share the same local storage names, then they're going to start trying to pull from one another, and we don't want that. So if you're working on multiple construct projects that have to deal with local storage, make sure that in each one of those games, those local storage names, or the items, I should say, the item names are unique. So great, we're checking if all these things exist, but the problem now is that, of course, they're not going to exist because we haven't created a way to create these items in the first place. And that's where the sort score is going to come in. So we're going to open this up, and we're going to be adding more code to this, just a little bit more. And I'll show you what it looks like here. So here we're going to add another local number, y, and this is an array location for saving to local data. And whenever we call this function, we're just going to make sure that our y is set to 0. So here's where we really get down to it. So whenever we call the sort scores function, after it finishes sorting everything out, we're going to repeat this process by the height of the array, so 10 times. And while y is less than the array high scores height, we are going to set player A, and the y will be the number. So like in the other example, player A 0, if y is 0, to we're going to set its value to what's in the array at this location. So in this case, if y is 0, then it would be what's at 0, 0. And then here it would be at 1, 0. Then we add 1 to y, and we go through this again, and we populate and save each of the local items. So that's why we want to call sort scores. Even if there's nothing changing really, we are saving and making sure we're keeping the local storage up to date. So let's go ahead and add this. Okay, so we added our y, and we got to set this set value y to 0. Okay, we did that. Set the y to 0, and then we added this repeat function, and it's setting the items hopefully appropriately. So let's go ahead and run this. So alright, so these are our high scores. And if we play, there's my name. Okay, and if we refresh, yes, so our high score is saved. Awesome. And if we refresh, yes, everything is saved. Great. So just one last tiny bit of thing. If you ever think about, I do want to reset all the high scores, we're going to create a function for doing that. So let's see, we're going to go back here, and on the score sheet, we're going to create a new group, and we're going to call it reset scores. We're going to add a sub event. So we're going to say on key pressed, and we're going to choose escape. Now you could make it possibly a combination of keys, or as complicated or simple as you want, but for now we'll just say that if you press the escape key, we are going to call all our three functions. So populate names, populate scores, and sort scores. So that way we're saving all of this to local storage. So now if we run this and we go back to our high scores, if we press escape, yes, everything resets. And press escape, everything resets. Okay, so that pretty much covers everything. We have successfully created a tool that will sort our scores and allow us to enter in our names and save them to our local storage. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. You found something that, hey, you could do something better. That code you have for going through all of these different items could possibly be done in some sort of for loop. Probably. Just haven't sunk that much brain power to figure out how to do that yet. But if you figure out how, then feel free to leave that suggestion in the comments. But thanks so much for watching, and I hope that you can use this to help make some pretty awesome games.